the government should really come in with these laws that say, hey, listen, you can't build here because this is not an appropriate place for you to build should the instance of natural disaster occur. And if you do build here, build with the intent and rules that are set out for you, because the views expressed in this podcast do not represent the views of the Organization of American States, its Secretary General, or its member states. Keep listening to find out more on this episode.
Welcome to The Zone, a podcast that serves as a platform for constructive dialogue among those of us who live in the adjacent zone, on relevant issues with a local perspective presented by young people from Belize and Guatemala, under the coordination of the OAS office in the adjacent zone, with the support of the Spanish Agency for International Development Cooperation. In one of our previous episodes, we discussed the issues of risk and disaster management in the agricultural sector.
And today's conversation will be a very informative one, so we can explore issues such as resilience, response, and recovery in the face of natural disasters.
And I must say, it is very important for us to be having this conversation and sharing this important information with our audience living in Belize and Guatemala and the world. As always, we invite you to share the link to this episode with your family and friends so that they can listen and learn something new.
For the purpose of this episode, we must first understand what type of disasters are more prone to affect our communities. According to the Global Humanitarian Overview 2022 by the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UNOCHA, Latin America and the Caribbean is the second most disaster-prone region in the world.
Can you imagine? I'm sure our audience might be wondering which specific disasters are the most frequent ones in our regions. No, we can categorize different natural hazards that typically affect our regions by disaster type, such as geophysical, which includes the earthquakes and volcano activities. We also have the hydrological, which includes floods and landslides. We have the meteorological, which refers to the storms and extreme temperatures. We have the climatological, which includes the droughts and wildfires. And if we were to arrange the natural hazards based on the frequently in the region, the top ones would be the floods, storms, followed by the earthquakes, droughts, landslide, wildfire, extreme temperatures, and volcano events.
As you mentioned with the frequency of these events, I can't help but think about the human and environmental costs caused by these natural disasters. Actually, the report titled The Human Cost of Weather-Related Disasters by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR, find out that about 90% of all disasters are weather-related and claimed approximately 1.23 million lives, an average of about 60,000 per annum, affecting over 4 billion people, which have been injured, left homeless, or are in need of emergency assistance.
Okay. Something else worth highlighting after seeing these high numbers of victims is that post-disasters recovery process are often on added challenges for the countries affected. In many cases, the best practice and policies to respond to those disasters are not in place in those countries.
Yeah, this is especially true for developing countries, especially those whose economies rely on the agricultural sector, like Belize and Guatemala. Countries that have few options when their coffee, cocoa, banana, and sugarcane crops are uprooted.
In the face of the natural disasters, the victims face the danger of death or physical injury, with the immediate effects of the disaster on buildings, personal properties, livelihood, and economic activities.
I actually had a question for you here, Gisela. Have you ever gotten to experience any of these natural disasters firsthand?
I was back in the city when the volcano was erupted, so that did affect Guatemala in a big...
Like the data we talked about, just mentioned, I think the Caribbean, it really is prone to a lot of these natural disasters. So I think a lot of times we do get a lot of instances of, I think it was meteorological disasters, where it's a lot of hurricanes and just like rain and flooding, which does like really affect both Belize and Guatemala a lot. Notably, the most recent one, Hurricane Lisa, which really did major amounts of damages to Belize, and I could imagine those effects also affected Guatemala in some way as well.
Indeed, it did pass through Melchor Domingo, which is in the adjacency zone. Now, here we had a lot of flood. Thank God it was just when it came to Guatemala, it was already a storm, a tropical storm. It was not a hurricane anymore, but we were actually affected. There were many people who needed to evacuate their homes because they were all flooded.
Okay. Well, it's really something to really think about the state of just climate change, really, which is a larger conversation on that end. So, according to the report, the human cost of weather-related disasters by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk and Reduction, 89% of deaths caused by natural disasters occur in lower-income countries.
This is definitely a shocking figure here. Now, unfortunately, natural disasters also magnifies the inequalities that have long been a problem for a variety of people. Now, including minorities, ethnic groups, women and girls, and people with disabilities, among others.
This really breaks my heart because what comes to mind is thinking about homeless people in our countries, or like elderly people who stay at elderly homes, or people who are like in wheelchairs. Like, it really opens the question as to what are we doing for these homeless people. Where can the elderly go to for aid and assistance during these natural disasters? What are people in lower income households doing? Like people who are living in areas not prepared for the hurricanes. Maybe I know of people who maybe live in places below sea level that get really flooded sometimes, and sometimes their homes get washed away with along with all of their belongings. It's just a really it's something I think we don't talk about enough. I think in Belize City, actually, during Hurricane Lisa, we actually had an old folks' home, a home for the elderly. Their roof got completely blown away. So it's like, what do you do in that situation? Where's the backup there? That's something I think we really should have. More units for these people who are really, like mentioned, the minority, really people who really urgently need that help.
At that moment, maybe you can get evacuated and then they'll give you somewhere to stay, but what comes after it? Because imagine being in a position where you've been working 3 months, you want to buy a new television for you. You work 3 months, hardly you stop buying some things that you might like because you want a TV, and then suddenly there's a flood and you need to evacuate, and then that stay there, and then you need to start all over again.
Yeah, and that's the real horrible mishap of natural disasters. Those can be very unpredicted. Of course, with satellite imagery, we can predict maybe a week or two ahead. But like, are you ever really like at a point in life where, okay, I'm prepared for a natural disaster? It's a huge inconvenience no matter when it strikes, and it puts a halt on all your plans. And I like what you said there, what happens after, because we talk about, oh my gosh, the hurricane's coming, you could prepare for it, but then nobody talks about the incredible aftermath, destruction, and like lengthy rebuilding process of just rebuilding your home for after this horrible thing has happened. I think a lot of people are grateful enough to be relieved. Okay, it's gone and over. But a lot of people, this is a nightmare that they have to deal with for weeks, maybe months to come afterwards.
Or even more, because maybe there's a lifetime story under that house that was just washed away.
Yeah, and I definitely think that these people are people we should start taking into consideration more during our natural disasters. So coming back to what I said, the immediate aftermath of the disaster could be very disorienting, marked by displacement, shock, and strong needs to restore order.
Now, moving on into the topic of best practice in disaster risk management, I must mention that according to the UNDRR, disaster risk management is the application of policies, strategies, and approach aimed of preventing new disaster risk, reducing existing disaster risk, and managing residual risk. contributing to the strengthening of resilience and reducing the risk of disaster losses.
So I would also like to add that there are different types of disaster risk management strategies, which should include prospective disaster risk management, corrective disaster risk management, and compensatory disaster risk management. The two I feel are most relevant to our communities are community-based disaster risk management and local and indigenous people approach to disaster risk management.
I do agree with what you just said. Now, the community based approach promotes the involvement of potential affected communities in disaster risk management at the local level. This includes community assessment of hazards, vulnerabilities, and capacities, and their involvement in planning, implementing, monitoring, and evaluation of local actions of disaster risk reduction. On the other hand, local and indigenous peoples' approach to disaster risk management in the recognition and use of traditional indigenous and local knowledge and practice to complement scientific knowledge in disaster risk management and for the planning and implementation of local disaster risk management.
Thanks so much for expanding on those terms because it's true, local communities play a huge role in preparing for disastrous events as they are usually the first responders to act. In some cases, when local governments lacked a response system, local and indigenous communities have been responding to and managing disaster risk for centuries.
Well, thank you so much. I do appreciate you mentioning this disaster risk management that has been around for a long time, with ethnic groups in Central America adapting to natural hazards with their own knowledge and traditional practice in the region rich in natural and cultural resources. As we mentioned before, we would like to share with our audience relevant information on the regional body in charge of furthering good practice and policies in terms of natural disaster reduction in the Western Hemisphere.
So, moving on, I want to now refer to the Inter-American Committee of Natural Disaster Reduction. So, it's the main forum for the Organization of American States responsible for analyzing issues related to natural disasters and other disasters, including the prevention of and mitigation of their effects, in coordination with the governments of member states, competent national, regional, and international organizations, and non-governmental organizations.
As we know, both the Caribbean and Central America are increasingly affected by natural disasters, causing impacts that cannot be solved easily. This is why some of the policies and strategies developed by the IACNDR aim at reducing natural disasters through the implementing of sustainable development mechanisms by addressing countries' vulnerability. And finally, high priority was given to the design of emergency preparedness, response coordination, and cooperation tools so that international and national assistance is more efficient and rapidly deployed.
Staying on the topic with best practices and policies, the Department for Sustainable Development, DSD, on the General Secretaries of the Organization of American States, GSOAS, with the support of the World Bank, executes the Caribbean Emergency Legislation Project, SELP. So the objective of the project is to build legislative capacities to enhance legal and institutional frameworks for states of emergency and the budget appropriation in 11 CARICOM countries and the Dominican Republic. So in the case of Belize, the project aims at establishing a national building code, stringent zoning rules, reliable funding arrangements to include disaster prevention and mitigation. Going back to the stringent zoning rules, I think that's also something really important and appropriate. So in the case of Belize, I know that places like Belize City are actually below sea level. So I think having building codes is really important there because you have to ensure that citizens aren't building their homes with designs that aren't that aren't suitable for the environment. So you wouldn't want them to build homes that are ground level that could be easily flooded. So I know I do take note that some areas in Belize City actually have their homes on stilts because they live in marshy areas that are prone to flooding as well. And so I think though like having building codes is really important, and zoning rules is also important. You wouldn't want families building homes on areas that are really prone to like have major floodings. You don't want their homes to be washed away or anything like that. So I think I like the idea of these rules being implemented for people's safeties.
That's definitely a great idea. In the case of Guatemala, the World Bank approved a development policy loan aiming to increase Guatemala's capacity to quickly mobilize resources in the aftermath of advanced natural events or health-related emergencies, as well as to support the modernization of the country's legal and institutional framework to manage disasters and climate risks.
Okay. Developing and implementing a plan like this to address the risks of communities settled in the adjacency zone could result in reducing the risks of loss of life, property, and natural resources. Since such impacts harm the progress that these communities have achieved towards their own development and that of the country as a whole. Which is ideal because when we build resilience, we are very prepared to face a natural disaster and we can mitigate the impacts of these events in the future.
You just mentioned a term that is a key and central in this conversation, resilience, and in our next segment, we will explore this term in more detail. We hope that our audience finds this primarily data interesting and useful, so you can learn more about what is being done at a global and regional levels to manage and mitigate disaster risks.
Okay. That's correct. And besides talking about resilience, we'll also be addressing the other two relevant issues, such as response and recovery in the face of natural disasters. But before, we want to leave you with the following material so you can learn more about today's topic.
Hundreds of disasters happen every year. We can't always prevent them from happening, but we can limit the scale of devastation, which is where disaster risk reduction, DRR for short, comes into play. So here are 10 things you should know about DRR. 1. We'll start with a rundown of facts from 2001 to 2010. In that time span, disasters caused nearly $1 trillion worth of damage. That's more than the value of Google, Walmart, and Toyota combined. A staggering number of people lost their homes, 28 million. That's the entire population of Australia. Disasters claimed 1.1 million lives over the course of the decade, an average of 300 deaths each day. 2. Think you know what a natural disaster is? Surprise, there's really no such thing as a natural disaster, only natural hazards, like floods, earthquakes, and tsunamis, or man-made hazards, like riots and conflicts. Our vulnerability to these hazards determines their impact. Simply put, disaster risk equals hazard times vulnerability. 3. Disasters expose inequalities. The more vulnerable the population, the worse the disaster's impact will be. When an earthquake strikes a poor country, more deaths and more economic losses will likely occur than when it hits a rich country. And in any country hit by a disaster, the most vulnerable and excluded suffer most. 4. DRR means managing disasters, which requires managing risks with different tools. Hard interventions include protecting buildings and infrastructure. Soft interventions include education and training. These tools are part of a broader initiative to make communities more resilient by ensuring they have more capacity to cope with a range of threats, from environmental to socioeconomic. 5. The approach taken to address one disaster may unexpectedly lead to further disasters. For example, you may grow more rice to alleviate malnutrition, but rice requires heavy irrigation and mosquitoes breed in standing water, which can lead to more malaria cases. 6. Disaster response needs to involve local people. Communities have a wealth of valuable skills and knowledge to offer. Working closely with local people helps them develop the skills needed to handle future disasters, like rebuilding homes or search and rescue. 7. DRR can help create positive change. It can make communities more safe and secure, making it easier to focus on long-term development aims, like building hospitals and training teachers. 8. Caring about DRR also means caring about climate change. Increasingly unpredictable weather brings new challenges, like higher crop prices and conflict over natural resources. These challenges make it harder for communities to adapt, cope, and respond to risks. Helping people deal with climate change will support efforts to make disasters less destructive and disruptive. 9. DRR also needs to account for changes in how people live. For example, more people are living in cities, exposing them to a larger number of hazards, from diseases to gang violence to floods. 10. Disaster risk is everyone's business. Anyone working on development or aid responses needs to think about disaster risk to make sure their efforts don't end up putting more people at risk. Collaboration is also key. Organizations can achieve more by working with one another and with civil society groups.
We're back. Now, Azer, what are your thoughts about that video?
I think the video actually highlighted a lot of key points that we sometimes overlook when we think about disaster risk management. The one I think that stood out for me the most was actually when sometimes you're trying to, relieve an effort, you actually accidentally could cause something worse. The example used in the video was, trying to solve hunger while planting more rice, but rice needs still water to grow, which actually goes ahead and is a breeding place for mosquitoes. So it's stuff you would never even think about. And I think now it's definitely it definitely highlights that people should start doing more research when thinking of ways on how to solve issues within their community, because you never know when you could just throw something off balance.
In general, education is definitely a key point for a lifestyle.
Definitely. So yeah, the video was overall super informative, and I definitely would encourage people to go back and rewatch because there's just so much that we don't think about sometimes, and you don't know unless you know.
Natural hazards highlight the necessity for best practice in disaster risk management as the impact of hurricanes and earthquakes, threatening the progress of achieving sustainable development and our own lives.
So on that note, we have seen that natural disasters tend to have greater impacts on smaller developing countries, which tend to have less diversified economies and on many occasions are not prepared to respond to disasters. These impacts cripple the already small economies of these countries and make it harder for them to start relief and recovery actions. For the purpose of better understanding the practices, we will separate them based on 3 areas: resilience, response, and recovery.
First, we must understand that resilience, in the context of risk disaster management and defined by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, is the ability of a community exposed to natural hazards to resist, observe, accommodate to, and recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner, including through the preservation and restoration of the essential basic structure and functions.
Some resilience building measures include the use of science in development of effective early warning systems based on the advancements in monitoring and forecasting weather for relative hazards.
And I must add that combined with efficient coordination, communication, and emergency preparedness, this can result in the reduction of the disaster impact, such as saving lives and property destructions.
I think we should refer to a country leading the way on these issues in the region. We are talking about Chile, a great example of good governance in terms of planning for the future. Chile actually has laws in place that establish strict building codes and for making building owners liable for losses resulting from poor construction.
In my opinion, having a national adaptation plan is a must, but also developing local adaptation plans for communities should be the way forward, which was the case of Dominica. The country, through community adaptation assessment, was able to identify risk, rank them on the severity of the levels of social, economic, and environmental impacts, and finally develop a comprehensive list of national priorities.
Thanks so much for sharing that with us. I would also like to focus on the type number 3, which refers to the act of identifying and focusing adaptations on sectors like weather, health, and agriculture. For example, let's take into consideration the local water and sanitation systems in our communities. By carrying out an assessment, the state would be able to identify the potential impacts of flooding on water quality. These would result in promoting water management and finding alternatives to prevent the degradation of water quality in the event of a natural hazard.
Now, talking about post-disaster recovery, the process it entails can also be challenging. There are many steps that can be taken for recovery, such as initiatives to ensure that communities restore their livelihood after natural hazards, as well as addressing potential remaining risks and vulnerabilities.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that example. We've learned that from the cases of Chile and El Salvador. In our next segment, we'll be discussing a role of national institutions in charge of leading the way in disaster management and preparedness in Belize and Guatemala.
Pensamos que no iba a llegar a más, que no a nadie iba a dañar, pero lastimosamente sí nos dañó a todos. No nos esperábamos, dijimos que no va a llegar, dijimos, y ya como a la 1 de la mañana subía y subía el agua más rápido y empezó a subir otra vez más rápido y más rápido.
Allá está la escuela. Ahí se quedaron algunos cuadernos de nosotros. Ya no se mira ahora.
Ya nadie sabía qué hacer y empezamos a sacar algunas cosas, pero la mayoría se quedó abajo.
Aquí era la iglesia. Allá está mi casa, ¿ve? Allá. Donde está, se mira ese palito. Ahí jugamos con mi hermanito, pero ahora ya no se mira. Solo tristeza me da.
Es importante alimentarlo bien. No sé si tiene dudas, preguntas.
Siento que es un sueño que nunca ha pasado y quisiera despertarme y ver que esto nunca pasó.
Wow, there was definitely a disheartening video. It was really hard to watch, to be honest.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, seeing that it really seems difficult to even fathom what it would be like to lose everything you have. It was really if you're watching that on the other side of the screen, I think it's just really a good reminder to be grateful for what you have. In terms of what you can do, I think going just back to being educated, I think it's really important to just keep up to date and informed with the local news, with your local weather forecasts. I know that's how a lot of people in Belize actually got the chance to go ahead and make the necessary preparations for Hurricane Lisa. And I think that, just being always attentive and with what's going on with your weather forecast is really important. And also, I think going back to what we mentioned with building laws and zoning, I think those are just other things that should be implemented really, because these people probably weren't aware that this place was prone to this type of flooding, or maybe they did, but they don't have the they don't have the resources to build better houses that require better rules, which is why, the government should really come in with these laws that say, hey, listen, you can't build here because this is not an appropriate place for you to build should the instance of natural disaster occur. And if you do build here, build with the intent and rules that are set out for you, because build to uphold what you have for future. You never know what's going to happen.
Exactly. And in hand with this, also educate. Above anything, educate people, because it's not just about informing them, because I can tell you, but if I don't actually teach you, if I don't give you the material, the necessary material, it would be hard for you to actually understand.
I agree with what you're saying, and all the material is very important. Like, who do I call? Who can I go to for resources? Like, where do I go to if this stuff happens? So I definitely think in being educated and informed is very important in these situations. So this also shows children living in poverty, children belonging to minority groups, and children living in temporary or unstable housings are particularly vulnerable because such social contexts increase the possibility that they experience the harsh impacts of such events.
Yeah, you're right there. Now, let's think about helping communities in ways that deal with shelter, nutrition, and emotional support. Our communities need all the help they can get in those situations, and any assistance you can provide can go a long way in the recovery of these persons and the recovery process in general.
And now we're going to refer to the national agencies of our countries. We start with the Coordinadora Nacional para la Reducción de Desastres, CONRED, de Guatemala. It was created in 1996 as the entity in charge of preventing, mitigating, attending to, and participating in the rehabilitation and reconstruction of damages derived from the presence of disasters. As its name indicates, CONRED is a coordinator. This means that its job is to bring together all these participants, provide them with reliable, accurate, and timely information, establish efficient communication mechanisms, and provide an adequate methodology for disaster reduction.
Thank you very much for sharing this information with us. Now, I want to tell you about the National Emergency Management Organization, NEMO, of Belize. It was created on February 1st, 1999, after Category 5 Hurricane Mitch, threatening Belize for 5 days in October 1998. NEMO was established to prepare for the response to hurricanes and floods. It has now expanded its mandate to include other hazards. NEMO is the designated government of Belize department and authority responsible for keeping Belize in a state of preparedness for any emergency that may require a national response.
As a way to stay updated on potential and imminent disasters and take the necessary pre-disaster preparedness measures advised by our national experts in disaster risk management and mitigation.
Focusing on the actions that we can take at the community level, there are many factors that can be adapted for communities to become resilient. Risk analysis will help leaders and residents anticipate all the imminent hazards that the community can face, such as floods, hurricanes, and wildfires. Additionally, a soft intervention initiative for the community indicates that the including of disaster-related programs, which would ultimately help kids in understanding how to act and behave during and after a natural hazard.
Something that we must keep in mind when developing these responses and preparedness plans is to always include the community knowledge, as they have faced and recovered from hazards in the past. They know how and what methods of strategies could work better for them and local levels to handle future disasters.
With that said, we conclude this episode and hope it sparkles some reflection and interest to question and propose disaster risk management strategies for your community leaders to implement.
This episode wouldn't have been possible without the support of the Spanish Agency for International Development Cooperation and the Organization of American States for the Space of Dialogue between the youth of Belize and Guatemala. We invite you to share your experience and reflections on today's topic at the following telephone number of 501-610-6284. We'd also like you to go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel, as we put a lot of effort into creating these episodes just for you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.